Okay, on to the week that was. And this week at the agenda saw a Canadian business magnate turn to politics, an examination of Eastern European history, and changing attitudes towards the use of marijuana. The agenda's week in review begins, of course, with the battle over Bill 115. You all know Janet Ecker. She's a former education minister in Ontario when the Conservatives were in power, and she has said once upon a time, here's the fundamental problem. The union says this is a dispute about their rights to collectively bargain issues which they believe are important to their members and their workplace. The government of Ontario says this dispute is about their right to implement public policy which they have been elected to do. They see this very differently. Adam, who's more right?
I'm not sure they're not both right about that. That's not a cop-out. Look, I think everybody knows the government's imperatives here. I mean, they didn't campaign specifically on this last year. In fact, that was a flaw on the part of all parties, that they didn't really lay out what the sort of coming austerity, which everybody knew was coming, would look like. But I don't think there's any great secret that the province has a major financial challenge. They're worried about the credit raters. They're worried about the markets. They're also worried politically what will happen to them if they don't actually try and tackle it. And I think it would be a little naive to expect that they could just, for them to expect that the teachers would just roll over and accept austerity measures that they don't want to accept. So you can understand where they're coming from. That being said, I think the teachers have a fairly legitimate complaint in that the way the government approached this seemed to be almost designed to be combative. I think they tried to maybe try and maximize the political benefit of it, or at least try and play to their weakness and turn it into a strength. And what's wound up happening is it created a climate where I think the teachers felt as though they really weren't welcome at the table until it was probably too late, and then there was maybe a little bit of effort to engage them. But I don't think either side is wrong in the way they're looking at it. I think the problem is they missed some opportunities to maybe try and find compromise early on in the process.
But, Michael, if you look at the same set of facts, but look at them through such utterly different lenses, is there any way to kind of make common cause at the end of the day on this thing? Because it sure doesn't look like it right now.
Well, certainly the bargaining units are coming forward and saying if they had the opportunity to be able to have actual negotiation take place, that they may have been able to come to some sort of compromise. So I might suggest then, if that indeed is the case, then there needs to be further dialogue in order to be able to try and reach some middle ground. I wouldn't disagree with Adam being able to say that the concept of negotiation really didn't take place. It was a document that was put on the table, and
actually a YouTube video that was kind of started it all. I really want to get cheeky about it, yeah.
So certainly I would agree. I mean, I can empathize because I think that our positions with the unions and school boards are not far apart, because the school boards weren't also sitting there as part of a negotiation process either.
And if you're looking at this from the outside and you're trying to understand, is this an issue about workplace rights, or is this an issue about implementing public policy? Which should be of greater import?
Well, actually, I think it's an issue about trying to get a settlement. That's what it should be. And there's a saying somebody told me that, you know, anyone can negotiate a strike, that it's actually negotiating a settlement that's hard and takes some thought. And I think that whatever perspective you're coming from, everybody's objective should have been, and I sort of think the teachers went in assuming they were going to have to negotiate and that they weren't looking to go on strike initially, but that your objective going in is supposed to be, how do we get a settlement? So what do I give up? What do you give up? How do we make this deal? And I think that you're right, Michael, that, you know, the surprise was, I mean, I remember sitting at the partnership table the day after the first day of negotiations, everybody going, they were really mean, and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't what we expected at all.
Who was really mean?
That what was, you know, they were presented with, here's what you're going to get, and we're bankruptcy lawyers and we know how this works, and if you can't figure it out, we'll, you know, lock you in a room till you figure it out yourselves.
So the government was mean.
Well, I think they were surprised that it wasn't a dialogue, and it wasn't sort of nice and friendly, and it wasn't let's all sit down and work out our problem, because I think everybody knew that there was a fiscal problem. And some of the unions were saying, you know, we know we're going to end up having to freeze our wages. But I think the other issue is who wasn't there. So that there was this kind of weird thing where school boards weren't there, principals weren't there, but they were all rolled into this agreement. There's a lot of other stuff in Bill 115 besides just whether or not the rights are there or not. But the rights are a problem.
Hirat, how do you see it?
Well, you know what, it's a tough situation just because both sides have good arguments and they're both, you know, upset with one another and what's going on. But I think the fundamental problem here is that the students have been given their issues, and they've been handed in their classrooms, in their school experience, what really isn't supposed to permeate into the classroom. Now, we know that negotiations aren't the easiest thing in the world, and of course, with such terrible fiscal times and whatnot, new measures had to be taken. But the fact that student services are being taken away because of it just isn't right. And because we don't have a say in what goes on there, because we had no role to play in preventing this from happening, we're just seeing it as upsetting for us, and the fact that our classroom experience is being jeopardized because of it.
Where is your educational career at right now?
Well, I'm in grade 12, so I'm applying for universities. I have to get my extracurriculars on my resume. I have to get my marks up. I might need extra help for classes, and the extra help is being taken away. The extracurriculars are being taken away. Some teachers have even said that reference letters are going to be at jeopardy because of this. And I mean, especially for grade 12 students that want to have a relaxing year, as relaxing as it can be when you're applying for so many different places, it's so much uncertainty, so much confusion. And it's not at all what an ideal scenario would be for a graduating student.
He built one of the world's largest auto parts manufacturers, and now he's turning his attention to a new pursuit, Austrian politics. Let's do some of the background from the book, just for those who don't know you. Born in Austria, grew up in the Depression, parents were factory workers, you came to Canada in the middle 1950s with a few $100 in your pocket. Why'd you pick Canada?
Well, sometimes I'm a little hard on the Canadian bureaucracy, but I'm still saying they're the best, because I applied for visas to South Africa, Australia, the United States, and Canada. So the Canadian bureaucracy is the best because they came forward first with the visa.
So that's why you picked Canada?
That's why I came. The whole life is really a question of fated circumstances. Being at the right place at the right time, a lot of things can happen.
You started a little company that would eventually turn into a $25 billion, 100,000 employee empire. It was a little tool and die shop, right? What did you make?
Yeah, I'm a tool and die maker by trade. So in 57, I arrived in Canada in 54, right, with a little suitcase, couple $100 in my pocket, and that didn't last very long. So I arrived in Montreal, and so the last few days I was kind of hungry, not because I wanted to lose weight. I was hungry, had no money to buy food, and that left great impressions, right? And it's burned in my soul, right? So yeah.
And that business got started very, very small.
Yeah, and then I worked in a hospital for a while, and then I found a job in a machine shop, and a few years later, in 57, I rented a small garage, bought a few old machines on a down payment, and out I went hustling to get some work.
And there you go. And the thing that's funny, the book's called The Magna Man, but you didn't pick that name Magna, right? You bought a company called Magna, and that's how you got the name.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a company, I had a friend which I said, look, you really should meet the fellow which built Magna Electronics, right? So I met him once on a ski hill up in Collingwood, and he kind of said to me, look, Frank, I have this public company, I want to retire, why don't you sell your company and my company, and you will be one of the major shareholders, etc., right? And it suited my thinking at the time, because up to that point, I only had the managers participate in the profits. And from that point, and so I was looking for an instrument to also have the employees participate in the profits. And that's very difficult in a private company. So in a public company, it's a lot easier.
You are, of course, known for being successful at free enterprise, but you are also known as a guy who has coined this expression, fair enterprise. What does that mean to you?
Well, first of all, without free enterprise, there can be no free societies, right? So I'm a free enterpriser by thinking and its basic makeup, but the problem with free enterprise is there's a little bit of greed in every one of us, right? Those are instincts for the survival of the Homo sapien, right? But greed is a very destructive force. So in free enterprise, government checks the greed via taxation, right? And that leads to a buildup of bureaucracy and big governments, right? In fair enterprise, the basic philosophy on fair enterprise is the human charter of rights alone isn't sufficient. We have to fortify it with an economic charter of rights. economic charters of rights would lead to economic democracies, and economic democracies are the basis for democracy itself.
So your employees have always had kind of a piece of the action.
It later on, right? I mean, I think I always was sort of always had an open mind, but I had no great philosophies when I came to this country, and I think to begin with, I just wanted to do things so I will never, ever, ever be hungry again, right? When you be hungry, you gotta crawl, you gotta be subservient, and so I wanted to be a proud person, and so I achieved that, and then you get somewhat philosophical, and you look at the world, what are its problems, and I think your soul tells you, you know, well, maybe have some input, create a better, or participate in creating a better society.
What were your father's politics?
My father's politics were, it's known in the archives, he was a communist, huh? And his name was Anton Adelman, right? There's a little Jewish in him. And so anyway, but towards the end, I had him over once, and towards the end he could see that communism isn't really, its basic philosophy is great, but it doesn't work, right? Because any society which stifles its individuals in pursuit of productivity, ingenuity, creativity is a decaying society. We just got to see how can we help the people on the bottom to come up. What can we do to eliminate poverty?
Anne Applebaum is perhaps best known as a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist who has written extensively about Russia and Eastern Europe. She also has a new book out called Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956. As the title suggests, you're picking up the story right near the end of World War II up until the 1956 invasion of Hungary. And I wonder whether you came to any conclusions about, between Hungary, Poland, and East Germany, which of these three were most pliable at that time?
It's hard to talk about nations being pliable. I mean, certainly Poland had the biggest armed opposition, which lasted the longest, and then it had probably the most powerful underground opposition. East Germany had less of an opposition, but East Germany also was different because so many people left. You could leave, and so people did leave. Up until the time the wall was built in 1961, it was fairly easy. It got harder, actually, but you could walk over the border and still be in your own country and still be in Germany. So East Germany had this outlet the whole time, and many of the people who would have been dissidents or who would have organized opposition left the country. So it was sort of slightly unfair on East Germany to say that it had the smallest opposition, although I suppose that's the case.
Did Stalin have a master plan in 1945?
He didn't have a master plan in the sense that, you know, a Washington or presumably a Canadian politician would have one, you know, point A, B, C, D, and we're going to do this on this day. He had a sense of where he wanted to go, and he had the confidence given to him by his ideology that it would all work out in his favor eventually. And when the Red Army and the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, entered this region, there were certain things they put into place right away everywhere. There were certain institutions they took over immediately, regardless of whether or not they were sure in the end this was going to be one of their satellites.
Can you give us an example of some of the ethical chaos that would have been prevalent during this time that you write about?
You know, ethical chaos. When the Red Army comes into eastern Poland in 1944, who does it meet? It meets the Polish resistance. It meets, there's an armed resistance. They've been fighting in the woods for several years against the Germans. And many of those fighters, under orders from London, because the Polish government in exile was in London, make themselves known to the Red Army in the assumption that they're then going to fight their way to Berlin together. That doesn't happen. Instead, the Red Army meets them, disarms them, sends them to the east. Many of them end up in the labor camps. So if you're one of those fighters and you haven't yet revealed yourself to the Red Army, what do you do at that point? Do you slip away? Do you keep fighting? Do you now fight the Russians? Do you give up altogether? People had a very difficult decision to make right at that point. And some people did keep fighting, and then they were later sorry that they'd kept fighting because they fought, but the war was over. People weren't as supportive of them anymore. They wound up stealing from people in order to get food and so on. And they ran out of ammunition, so that it became more and more difficult to maintain that kind of resistance. And then there's a horrible moment where you decide, right, I give up. And then when you give up, you walk over the border, you walk back into your country, and you have nothing. You have no family. You've been fighting for your country for 3 years. You are a pariah. You have no property, no money, no recognition. And those were very tragic moments, I think.
If you were, again, going to explain to some of those people who are 25 or 30 years old who don't have any firsthand memory of the Cold War, explain the appeal of totalitarianism to those young people today. How would you do that?
I wouldn't say, it's not the appeal of totalitarianism. It's the appeal of communist rhetoric. That this is a system that's totally revolutionary, and remember, this is a part of the world that has been utterly destroyed by the war, and in which people have seen their societies collapse along with everything they believe in. And communism offers an alternative. Democratic liberal capitalism has failed. England and France did not come to our rescue. This is the victorious system. This is the system that defeated Hitler. It's a system that wants peace, it wants internationalism, it wants equality, it's going to create a better life for everybody, it's a special role for the workers and the peasants, and that had an appeal to people at that time.
Except it was all a big lie.
It was essentially a big lie, yes. I mean, it never, and as I say, the main thing about it was that it never did what it was supposed to do. At the most basic level, it never made the workers and peasants rich, or it never even made them as well off as their counterparts in Western Europe.
Do you think the lessons of communism have subsequently been learned by the whole world now?
Well, I wish I could say yes. I mean, I think they've been learned in some ways. I do occasionally encounter people under 25 who would like very much to believe it again, and I'm aware there are others around who have the same nostalgia for that period. And then, of course, there's North Korea, which remains a full-fledged Stalinist state, very similar to the ones I describe in this book.
Public opinion surveys in Canada show that 65% support the legalization or the decriminalization of marijuana. We've got a Gallup poll in the United States that finds that 62% of people ages 18 to 29 favor full legalization. Only 31% of senior citizens believe that. Alan, let's go to you first. How do you regard this shift towards a more pro-marijuana stance?
I actually don't think it's a shift. In Canada, the statistics have been clear since really 1972 that close to 70% of Canadians want a change in the law. Most of it's decrim, not legalization. There was a lull in the 80s, the Reagan era, just say no, people didn't talk about things, and there was a resurgence in the 90s, but it was the same public opinion. This has been about a failure in democracy because a majority of Canadians and Americans have wanted a change since 1972. So I don't see it as a shift, I just think it's more pronounced right now.
Kevin, how do you regard it?
Well, I think the devil's in the details. First of all, there's a huge difference between legalization, which would open the door to massive production and commercialization, which is really what I worry about. I don't want to see another tobacco industry targeting kids, and decriminalization, which would remove criminal penalties. I don't use either term. They're both confusing and vague. I think change is fine, but let's think about how to do that in a health paradigm versus these sort of sound bites. And so that's why I'm welcoming this discussion today.
Carl, do you think there's been a shift in attitude towards drug, either decriminalization or legalization over the past 25 years?
Well, I have to agree with Alan. I think that in general, people have been more supportive of marijuana, certainly decriminalization. As Kevin said, he doesn't like to use those terms. I think it's important because they have huge implications in terms of who goes to jail, who gets a criminal record, and who doesn't. Given that marijuana is our most frequently used illicit drug, they have huge implications. And so we clearly agree with Kevin in that we don't want industries or various organizations targeting kids because let's not forget that these are psychoactive drugs. And I don't think anyone is arguing that we should have more availability for kids.
Harold Calamp, where are you on this issue of public opinion shifting over the last couple of generations?
No, I would agree with Alan, too. I think all along it was clear that most people don't think kids should be sent to jail for possessing an ounce or so of marijuana.
How are you defining kids?
Adolescents, teenagers.
Teenagers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think everyone agrees that that sort of really strict law, or punishment rather, doesn't help society. On the other hand, as Kevin said, having the drug more readily available, making it much easier to use, especially making it easier for young people to buy it, is not something that most people would recommend.
Most people are not in jail, let alone kids, in jail or in prisons, I should say, for small amounts of marijuana when that's their only issue. So people are put in for multiple things. Marijuana is usually tacked onto that. Most people have to appear before a judge the next week, usually pay a civil fine and get on with it. What I think Carl was saying, which I would agree with him, is that the issue becomes on arrest records. So there's a difference between going to jail, which doesn't really happen for marijuana, but if you do have an arrest record, that could prevent you from, in terms of jobs, in terms of getting social assistance. And there are some states like New Jersey that actually have a program where your record is expunged after 6 to 12 months of abstinence and then you move on. I think those models would make sense. And so it's important to have a sort of adult civil conversation where we can discuss these specifics rather than get into this media narrative of you're either lock them up or legalize. The truth is not in either of those.
Sure.
extremes.
Carl, did you want to follow on that?
Yeah, I think that, again, Kevin is mostly right, but we need to take seriously this notion that in the U.S., for example, there are more than 800,000 arrests every year for marijuana. And when people get a blemish on their record, the likelihood of them coming back from that blemish is really low, particularly when we start looking at certain ethnic and racial groups. I mean, so I think Kevin, you're downplaying the impact of the sort of legal sanctions related to marijuana.
Kevin, you want one more time at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Carl, I don't get me wrong here. I think that that is an important issue, and that's why I brought it up. A lot of people will ignore it. It is an important issue, the blemish on your record, and that's why I think we need to look at how our laws are structured and how that happens.
It's not whether it's about prison or about arrest. Right. There's an earlier question. Should this be against the law? Because in principle, should you label a young person or an adult as a criminal for doing something that ostensibly is not harming society? That's the question. If you say there's harm, then it doesn't matter there's prison or arrest. It's deserving. So you got to get back to the primary question of why we're doing this in the first place.
We don't want to think about cannabis as being magical. I mean, I think the point was made very well that just like any other psychoactive drug, we have to take this seriously. And it has positive effects and negative effects.
That's right.
And when we think about weighing these different types of effects, we have to look at the risk-benefit ratio. I mean, if you're sucking burning weeds down your throat, we can expect that you might have some negative effects. The same is true with drinking alcohol and the potential toxicity to the liver. But there are beneficial effects with alcohol. It's been demonstrated that alcohol is associated with fewer strokes, fewer heart disease, and a wide range of things. But there's also that potential for the negative effects on the liver. The same is true with marijuana.
Let me get Kevin on this.
Yeah, so I think we need to separate the medical and therapeutic potentials, as I think the previous speaker did, and the harmful effects. I mean, we have a whole host of medications that are therapeutic that we also know are harmful. The opiates are a perfect example. Morphine is derived from opium. It doesn't mean that we ask people to smoke opium to get the therapeutic effect of morphine. We've isolated morphine. We deliver it in a way that you don't have to inject it in your arm with a needle, or you don't have to smoke it to receive the benefit. And we can do and I agree actually with Al as well, it is an exciting area of research. I mean, the medical side of it. Cocaine also has medical properties. That's why it's a Schedule II drug in the United States. There are ways that we need to separate it. On the health harms, though, which I think was the original question, of course, I agree with the previous statements that all drugs, have their harms, etc. But when we know, for example, the longitudinal scientific studies have been shown that for kids, if you initiate marijuana use, in other words, in adolescence, it's about a 1 in 6 chance of producing a dependence or addiction.
Proposed legislation from the federal government would see mentally ill offenders found not criminally responsible for their actions stay behind bars for longer periods. To help us examine what the new rules would mean to offenders and the public, we're joined now in Kemptville, Ontario via Skype by Heidi Illingworth. She's Executive Director of the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime. In the nation's capital, Anita Zaghetti, mental health law lawyer with the Toronto firm Hiltz Zaghetti. And with us here in studio, Sandy Simpson, Chief of Forensic Psychiatry at CAMH, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, and someone we're just going to call Roy. He's a volunteer at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health's Empowerment Council, and he's a former violent offender. And we welcome everybody, both here in the studio and in Points Beyond, to our discussion tonight, which we're going to start by reading a quote here from the Federal Justice Minister, Rob Nicholson, who had this to say last month. Quote, "We are listening to victims, as well as the provinces and territories, who are telling us that the safety of the public should be the paramount consideration in the decision-making process involving mentally disordered accused persons. We are committed to ensuring that our laws are strong and clear enough to protect Canadians in situations where high-risk accused found not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder pose a risk to the public." Let's just start with those three words, not criminally responsible. And Anita, I want to go to you first in the nation's capital. Give us some understanding of this sentence and what kinds of circumstances warrant it.
So, Steve, an individual is found not criminally responsible in the event they're found to have committed the sort of actus reus, the action part of a criminal offense, but they're lacking the associated mental state. So they're, by virtue of mental disorder, they're not able to appreciate either the nature or consequences of their actions or of knowing that they were wrong, either in law or morally. So that's when you get found not criminally responsible. It's a verdict, it's not an acquittal, but you have been convicted of nothing.
This is not an academic discussion for Roy, who has been through this. Roy, you were once deemed to be not criminally responsible after an act of violence, and I wonder, you didn't go, did you go to prison, I guess? No, you wouldn't have gone to prison.
I did. I did. Awaiting trial. I was detained in a detention center here in Toronto, at the West Detention Center and at the Don Jail.
Because at that point you had not been,
I hadn't been found NCR. I hadn't been found NCR. I was just charged with the crime, and so I was detained, and I waited in jail until my trial. The jails are horrendous. They're woefully inadequate to deal with mental illness. If somebody has a break, if somebody has a manic episode, they just put you in segregation, or the hole. It's called the hole, where they just put you in a room where you have no contact with anyone. And so thankfully I was well enough that, you know, I was put into a special needs range, they called it. People had various needs. It wasn't all psychiatric.
And once they found a place for you, though, you went to a psychiatric facility?
Once they found a bed for me, then I was transferred to the hospital.
For how long?
I spent about, as an inpatient at the hospital, 2 years, about 2 years.
Was it helpful?
Very much so, absolutely.
When people hear he's not guilty because he's not considered criminally responsible, there will be a chunk of the population that will think, just got away with one, didn't you? And the fact that you were improving, your emotional and intellectual impairment was lessening while you were in jail, will probably encourage people to come to that conclusion. Should they come to that conclusion?
If they knew me how I was before, when I was diagnosed in 1998 till about 2007, which was the date of the offense, people who know me and knew me wouldn't say that, because they saw what this illness did to me.
When victims of crime hear an example of somebody who did a crime, was found to be not criminally responsible, and now seems to have turned his life around, what's the reaction?
Well, I think that most victims would be very happy to hear that someone like Roy is doing much better. And what the families that I talk to, the individuals that I talk to on a regular basis, they are concerned about public safety. They don't want anybody else ever to be harmed in the way that they were, or that their loved one was. So, you know, a big concern for victims is the person going to go off their medication again or be non-compliant? And, you know, is that going to lead to deterioration and lead to another serious incident in the community? And do we have enough support in the community to properly monitor these individuals and to ensure that this doesn't happen again? That's what the concerns of victims are around, you know, mentally ill offenders and accused.
Sandy Simpson, that seems like a very legitimate concern. How do we make sure that your profession ensures that people who have been found not criminally responsible for crimes they've committed stay on their meds?
Well, it's not only my profession, but it's the responsibility of the person as well. I guess the moral basis of the NCR defence is that whilst you're not held criminally responsible for your action, you are held responsible for being meticulous about your mental health henceforth, and of me and people like me to be able to develop and run systems of care that will ensure that is so. We are dealing with human systems. We are talking about risk reduction, not risk elimination, and of course that is true with every issue of offender rehabilitation, whether that's to do with mental illness or not. We have, though, I mean, I think in general, a very good success is to report. We have, in terms of relativity between the risks of reoffending of someone who has a mental illness who's committed an offence versus somebody who didn't, generally the reoffending rates are about 20 to 25% of what it would be had you been held criminally responsible.
So significantly less.
So it's, 70–80% less than it would have been otherwise. So in general, people do very well. Of course, the reason they have offended is that they were unwell, and that is treatable. The reason other people offend is not treatable in the same way. So mentally ill offenders do much better, contingent on the quality of care they receive, clearly.
Let me thank all of you for coming in tonight and helping us with this very difficult subject. Anita Zaghetti from the law firm Hilt Zaghetti. She's been in Ottawa. Heidi Illingworth, the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime via Skype in Kemptville, Ontario. Sandy Simpson from CAMH. And Roy from the Empowerment Council. He's a volunteer at CAMH. Thanks so much, everybody. And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website. That's theagenda.tvo.org, or on our iTunes channel, or on the YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.